Most of the early podcasters hated the name podcast.
Today, what we are calling AI is just like Clippy on steroids.
Can you imagine streaming something at 56K today?
Frequently find myself saying, it works so well, we stopped doing it.
Get to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast.
Okay, I am here today with... there's been so many people this season where I'm like a podcasting legend, but this time I actually still mean it the same way I meant it the last 7 times. Podcasting legend, Rob Greenlee. How are you, Rob?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here, Matt. It's great to do your show. Yeah, I've been watching some of the past episodes, and they've been terrific. So
you have way too much free time on your hands, or you're lying. Either way, I appreciate it. So before we dig in, if anybody's unfamiliar with who you are, where you came from, give us 2 minutes. Who's Rob? How'd we get here?
Well, I started on the radio back in 1999, just to kind of take everybody through really quickly here, and did a nationally syndicated radio show up on the XM Satellite Radio Network and on about 15 broadcast stations, and did a lot of early work around streaming my content, and then eventually my show became a podcast back in September of 2004. So since the topic of the show that I was doing was about the growth and development of the World Wide Web and the internet, the show was called Web Talk Radio. And so really kind of took that experience that I had of building that show and started working for platform companies. In 2005, I got my first full-time job working for a podcast kind of platform distribution to mobile phones as far back as 2005. So I've been working in that and worked for Microsoft and Spreaker and Libsyn and Podbean and a bunch of companies. Podcast One out of Los Angeles. I was the chief technology officer down for Podcast One in the early days back in 2014. And I've been a podcaster that whole time too, doing podcasts for the platforms that I worked for. And in 2017 got inducted into the Podcast Hall of Fame, which I'm now kind of leading that. So there's a new Podcast Hall of Fame coming up here in January at the Podfest Expo down in Orlando. So I'm excited for that. But really at the end of the day, I'm a content creator, but also have extensive background working in software and working for, a company like Microsoft. And really built podcasting on the Microsoft platform back when they actually had podcasting. But they got out of that back in about 2014. That's when they dropped podcasting.
If only they were called Zunecasts, we'd still have them.
Back then, they were. And what's funny about it is that some things have come full circle, because back then I was really heavily involved in video podcasts. When I was working at Microsoft, that Zune portable media player had a large screen on it. Actually, sometimes they were larger than the iPod screen. So we had a real strong emphasis on the video podcasting stuff, which is kind of a full circle thing for me, because now we're coming back more into video as a linkage to podcasting.
Sure. I mean, and I think a lot of things probably are either full circle or halfway through their cycle.
Yeah, so it was a good idea back then, but maybe not now, has been my theme for many years.
Yeah.
And then maybe what was a good idea back then, maybe the time has come now. So
that's almost like mine. My business one, I frequently find myself saying, it works so well, we stopped doing it.
Yeah, right.
Which is even worse. Yes. So podcast Hall of Famer yourself, and you're active and working on the Podcast Hall of Fame now. Going into the Wayback Machine, it's 2004.
Yeah.
Was there such a thing as a Podcast Hall of Fame in the nether regions of your mind? Like how far have we come, really?
Yeah, back when I started making my radio show available as a downloadable file, I had actually already been working with a bunch of platforms that were doing it based on a proprietary platform, not based on an open standard like RSS. So the concept of making my content available to portable players, just like I said earlier, I was working on mobile consumption of podcasting and distribution as far back as 2005. So the whole thing, and prior to that, I was even working with platforms that were making, what is seen today as a podcast available via podcast-like methodology, but it wasn't using RSS. So, but back then, bandwidth was so constricted that everything was delivered really through a stream. And so, and it just feels like so many things are coming full circle to, the rationale for streaming back then is different than the rationale for today. But yet the same technology is being used. It's interesting how time and market trends kind of influence the use of technology and how those use cases change, but the technology sometimes doesn't really change that much. And you could actually say that about podcasting too, is that the core of podcasting really hasn't changed since I started podcasting in 2004. But there's elements that are evolving and slightly adjusting, but it's not really that much different, really.
Sure. Well, I mean, like on one hand, what I'm hearing you say is it was, it wasn't podcasting. It was just another way to syndicate radio originally.
Yeah. Audio content, but yet back in that time frame, there was a lot of video delivered that way too. And one of the reasons that it was delivered via streaming is because you could constrict the bandwidth that was utilized to deliver that file. And that was needed back then when everybody was dialing in on dial-up modems and not really getting, I think the peak of that on the dial-up modems was like 56K. So can you imagine streaming something at 56K today? It's not, and you had to get under that because you couldn't saturate their bandwidth. Also, you would get poor performance. So it's an interesting paradigm right now. We have so much bandwidth now, and it's so ubiquitous. And that was a lot of what I talked about on my radio show that I did, was about this wave of being able to get digital content that was coming. And a lot of people just didn't see wireless as being something that would have high bandwidth, that could deliver live video and things like that we see as commonplace today. And it felt revolutionary back then to even think about it.
Well, and I think what changes too is, I've talked about this before, is, expectations change, right? Mm-hmm. So you're on a 56K modem or even, a 1.5 meg DSL line back then. Yeah. You're kind of playing to the novelty factor. Like, look over here, I've got moving pictures on my laptop. Yeah. It's amazing.
Well, you were, definitely. Yeah, I agree with you.
And now you have people being like, I expect 4K content to never buffer, and if it does, your service is terrible.
Yeah, right.
So,
yeah. and then 6K and then 8K, it's all, 360-degree video. I mean, we're clearly on that path to taking things to the moon on this.
Yeah, and I frequently talk about 8K content in a 5G world, and it's a whole lot of bandwidth flying around the airwaves.
In order for that to work, bandwidth's got to be pretty cheap.
It's got to be cheap, but I think the hard part,
accessible, right?
Accessible is probably one of the things I think a lot about when it comes to podcasting is circa 2004, 2005 when we were just starting hosting podcasts. It was the difference between it working or not working, whether you had it hosted on a CDN, right? Like if the people in Australia cannot access my content, they keep telling me it's too slow and they cancel. That's where we were from an infrastructure standpoint, say 20 years ago. Today and that was borderline table stakes, right? The expectation was like, well, listen, if you're just hosting it from one, shared web server in Virginia, you can't expect it to, you can't expect people in Australia to work. Today, it's the opposite, right? It's like, well, I've got it hosted in a server in Virginia. I don't understand why it is not working.
Yeah.
And so now it's more about meeting that expectation of like, of course it should work. I'm in Australia and it should work. Why isn't it? And leveling up to the expectations when, as let's call it the ugly underpinnings of the internet haven't really changed a whole lot, right? Like we're still speaking the same protocols, it's the same technology stack. We're just going, we've been pretty good at upgrading fiber. So now there's more bandwidth available. Or, in the case of wireless, we've done really well at increasing our ability to multiplex spectrum.
Yeah.
I think it probably goes with the leading question of the Podcast Hall of Fame, right? Which is, if there's a Podcast Hall of Fame, there's a whole lot of expectations on how approachable, easy, usable podcast should be. And I think, my mom is still really excited when she is able to, and that's her words, watch an episode of my podcast.
Mm-hmm.
She's not very excited when she's able to turn on her TV or turn on her radio. So there's still, at least for, an older generation, there's still this perceived technology barrier to entry thing that's there. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's this new generation coming up. And I'd love to hear your perspective on let's call it the short form, short attention span generation that is going to be the next wave of potentially long form content audience. How do those new people see it?
Yeah, I think it's really been fascinating to see how we've evolved from kind of a perception. I mean, I remember many years with YouTube is that everybody was saying that if you're going to post something to YouTube, it needs to be 5 minutes or less, else it's not going to get watched, right? And then we've seen this kind of evolution. If you look at Twitter started out with a very limited character count, which you could enter in there. And then over time, it got longer and longer and longer. That isn't to say that short form content doesn't have a place in the ecosystem. It does, but long form content has a place as well. And it may be, I think the battle of what we see in the market today is everybody wants something a little bit different potentially, or they have a different mix in what they're doing. And people are expecting that. And that's part of what's pushing this other conversation around, well, what is a podcast, right? I mean, what's the scope of what a podcast is in the modern ecosystem of content today? One could, if you even look at it from a historical perspective, where podcasting was video, right? And it was quite big back in the early days of podcasting. It was probably 40% of the podcast market was video podcasts. I mean,
our two biggest shows were like Dignation and Twit and maybe
Twit, right?
Adam Carolla. I can't remember if he was video too or just audio, but those were like the three big bandwidth pushers early.
Yep. So now we've seen the kind of evolution of the medium that a lot of people don't really talk about too much, at least in the podcast industry, because they don't really want to talk about it, is that from an audience perspective, the audience is starting to see podcasting as a lot of different things, right? And I'm really using that term as a differentiational term to describe online media, right? As a contrast to television, right? Sure, video podcast content can be consumed on a television, but it isn't content that's defined as television, right? So it needs its own unique word. Just using the term video or audio doesn't really give it the gravity or the pizzazz that it needs to, capture a listener or a viewer's attention and think of that they're doing something novel or unique. So, having a term like podcast has always kind of caught the imagination of the consumer side. In the early days of podcasting, and a lot of people don't realize this, but most of the early podcasters hated the name podcast. They didn't like it.
Podcasts.
Yeah. Well, Leo is an example really of that.
Yeah.
Right. Leo was an example of it. He had this opinion that, and many others in the podcasting space, that the term podcast was too much linked to a consumption platform, the Apple iPod, that was eventually going to go extinct. And guess what? It did, right? So that premonition was accurate, but the transfer that's happened is that term is now transferred to a lot of different forms of digital media. And if you think about podcasting, it had audiobooks in the early years, and that still exists. I mean, Audible as a company has struggled with this concept of being seen as a podcasting company for years, right? They even tried to get into the podcast industry and try and do, they launched a platform called WordCast. This was like back in 2005, 2006 timeframe, and they were trying to use digital DRM to be able to build a platform that could help podcasters monetize, just like an audiobook is done through Audible today. So they tried to do that. It failed because Audible misunderstood the place that podcasting was in at that time, which was very anti-commercial. So back in that time frame, commercialism around podcasting was really kind of looked down upon. It wasn't really something. My radio show had ads in it, and I got bashed by the podcast industry in the early days because I was considered to be a sellout, right? I was running ads in my show, and it wasn't as pure as what the intent of the medium was, which was anti-commercial.
Right. You were letting capitalism interfere with the quality of the art.
Experience, right? It was all about, a social experiment at that time.
Sure. Yeah. I even if we think about the name, it sort of encapsulated also that at the time there wasn't that much competition for people's attention. Right. So like this was something for those who don't know, the original idea of the podcast, at least as it was explained to me, was like, this is something you're going to download overnight on your iPod. And then, during your commute on the train, you can put it in and listen to what you decided to consume last night at 10 p.m., what you were subscribed to. Yeah. And if you didn't, you were just going to either read a magazine or... You were going to miss out. or stare blankly at the poster on the subway in front of you for the next hour and 15 minutes, or gasp, have to make conversation with another human.
Yeah.
Today, it's a different world.
It's ubiquitous access.
So you can get whatever you want, and then you combine that with, I would even probably be off by an order of magnitude when like how many podcasts one could go download. Forget all the other things you could go do on your phone today. But even if you just said, I want to watch a podcast right now, I don't know, there's a couple million to choose from. In a world where you can literally do anything, and there's now millions of podcasts out there, how does one become discoverable today compared to, like, obviously 20 years ago it was like, oh, you have one, amazing, therefore I have found it and I will watch it. It's not really like that today, and there's so much competition for people's attention. If you're a new content creator, you want to get into it, how do you get people to find you?
It's really the question of the last 5 years in podcasting is that, and it's increasingly the question is also, well, how do I make money from it? And so we've seen this shift over time of people increasingly wanting to make content creator status, right, or creating a podcast as a career, right, and they want to make money from it. But as far as the marketing side of it, that has become more challenging. You can attack it from a content focus perspective, or you can attack it from, a broad stroke and treat it like any other business, or how radio did with like a talk show or something like that. They just had to blast it out with marketing and promotion and get out in the real world and do live events and do, an outreach. But podcasters have a unique challenge is that, like you said, there's millions of shows out there now, especially on a global scale. And so how do you stand out in that environment? Plus now we're crowded by TikTok, and we're crowded by Instagram, and we're crowded by, X, Twitter, where people are spending vast amounts of time. So, but we have seen this content kind of merge with those platforms and become accessible on those platforms too. But those platforms are not considered to be podcasting platforms, but they are platforms that consume podcast-like content, right? Which is, this gets back to what the definition of a podcast is, and why we have the ecosystem we have right now, and why the podcast industry is so conflicted is because they want to be seen as this RSS-based distribution, unique distribution platform, and that's separate from all these other consumption platforms. And that's probably heading in the wrong direction. That's probably trying to act like you're swimming upstream, right? When the world is coming at you and you don't really want to see what's right in front of you. And I think that is something that's been going on in the podcasting industry for the last year, especially. because a lot of the infrastructure that was built for podcasting is built around an audio only strategy, right?
Sure.
So if you think of yourself as only an audio only medium, then that limits your view and scope of these other platforms like a YouTube or a Instagram or even a LinkedIn or some of these platforms that can consume the same content. I don't see people putting out audio episodes into LinkedIn. I don't see people putting out any kind of just audio into really any other platform other than just RSS-based distribution. So everything else is shifted over to video. So I think it's logical for us to conclude that probably video is going to have a larger presence in podcasting as we look to the future. And it's really, for me, it's like, back to the future, right? It's like going back and bringing what happened in the past forward, but it's happening in a different way this time.
Sure. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't try and put a gun to your head here then. So, Rob, what is podcasting?
I think podcasting, from a listener, there's two ends of the spectrum. There's from a listener perspective, and then there's from a viewer perspective, listener, viewer, consumer perspective, and then there's the industry perspective. And oftentimes when I talk about this, I'm talking about the listener side, but the creator side or the industry side or the distribution side thinks that I'm talking about them. And that's been where the conflict is happening, is that they don't have to think of it the same way I do. I'm thinking of it the way the consumer side is looking at this. And when a viewer or a listener looks at a piece of content from this content creator that happens to be in a video form, but looks and sounds like a podcast, guess what? They're going to think it's a podcast. And I think in the big picture, and increasingly other people in the industry are moving this direction too, is that the industry shouldn't care. But the only reason they care is because the technology infrastructure was built primarily for audio. And that's what they have, made their investments in. So as we look to the future, I think what we have to do is open our minds to think, well, and maybe think more about what the audience is thinking about. And I think that is another paradigm shift that's important as we look at commercial radio, because commercial radio, and my experience with it, has primarily always thought about their advertisers first and their audience second. Where podcasting, we should be thinking about audience first and then the commercial side, which is an exact opposite of what mainstream media has typically done. So that's kind of how I'm seeing it, is that we need to include pretty much all digital content now under the definition of as a podcast now.
A podcast is something I want to watch or listen to. Is that like
exactly? I mean, it can be. I mean, and for years, a podcast could include a PDF too. Back in the early days, the RSS spec included any kind of a digital file attachment to that attachment code in that RSS. And early podcasters used to deliver a PDF file with an MP3 file or a PDF with a video file in the RSS. Apple used to support it. So all I'm saying is that I think we have to open our minds to what a podcast is and accept the fact that we've moved into a new era where there's a lot of different types of content: short, long, video, audio, music, books, other forms of short form content, paid subscription, that now can be called a podcast. I think it's okay. And I think that's good for the consumption side.
And what's the trap that people can, on the creator side, fall into if they don't want to widen and don't want to broaden that definition?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a trap. I think at the end of the day, this is all about choice, and thinking about this, I think it's valid to come at from a audio first perspective. There are certain genres of content that don't lend themselves to video, right? And there's other types of content that lend themselves more to video than to audio. So you got the full spectrum. So I'm not saying that every podcaster needs to do everything. but I do think that there's some use cases and some genres that would benefit from doing video and audio at the same time with the same content. Maybe making some derivative content from that, just like what you're doing with this program.
Yeah.
And so this is an example of where we are today. This isn't a projection of what it's going to look like 2 or 3 years from now. This is a projection of how the digital ecosystem works today. And if you want to fit into that and reach the most audience in the way that audience wants to be reached, and that's the key, is that the audience wants to be able to find your show in audio and in video based on their consumption situation.
Right. And would you say that this is the right growing pain for the industry to be in, let's call it 20-ish years into it? Or are we behind the curve, ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I think it is the right place. I think when YouTube decided that they were going to, embrace the term podcast, they basically exposed a scenario that has been with podcasting the whole time. YouTube had a big impact on the decline of video podcasting in the early days. When video podcasting was big, then YouTube launched and basically siphoned all those creators over to YouTube. So YouTube has been a core contributor to the podcast industry all these years. So the only thing that's really changed is that now we recognize what's been going on for a long time. And the research is starting to show that the consumption patterns and what the audience and the users of this content is increasingly wanting and that's choice.
Right. Yeah, and in my mind, that shift to YouTube was mostly economic originally.
It was because it was free hosting.
Yeah. Why pay me when you can get it for free?
Right. Well, and if the platform can pay the content creator, back in the early days, they were starting to monetize and helping creators make money. So it was an early kind of glimpse of what YouTube was going to become, and that was really the biggest digital media platform in the world, and it is today.
Yeah, and like today, it's to me anyway. Like this goes on YouTube, notwithstanding that I could host it myself for free. Yeah, free-ish.
Right.
But I'm there for the network effects, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is like hey, it's shareable. There's suggestions. It's in my mind now, it's the world's biggest recommendation engine. And that's where I sort of see the value in publishing there, because I can see, I don't really have a brand that matters, but there are certainly a lot of people that are apprehensive about sort of funneling everything through YouTube because it's their audience, their brand. There's people are reluctant to get rid of control. And a lot of the people that still host a lot of, let's call it podcast-ish video on platforms like ours are people who are saying, I want to control the player experience. I want to control my audience. I don't want the next video up to be my competitors. If you liked Coke, wait till you see this new video from Pepsi that's coming up next.
Yeah.
But at the same time, in my mind, the con list is very small against the pro list for what you gain by tapping into those network effects. But how do you see that part of it?
Yeah, I think that there is something to give up, and I think that's what the podcast industry is wrestling with is the influx and the increasing power of the large proprietary platforms, like a YouTube. But podcasting has always been impacted by large proprietary platforms. I mean, I used to work for Microsoft. I ran the second largest podcast platform in the world back in the early days of the medium. And, we never surpassed Apple's presence in the podcasting space, but we were a strong second. We were probably in about the same position in the early days of podcasting as Spotify is today. But as we look to what the reality of today is that Spotify may be on a global scale, and I think that's the real differentiational point here is that Spotify is stronger outside of the U.S. than they are in the U.S. And that is really driven by the ubiquity of Android, and how that has been kind of a weak area for Apple on the iPhone. And so sure, Apple's strong in the U.S. and North America, in the West primarily, but everywhere else in the world, lower cost phones, lower cost Android devices has basically ruled the market. And so Spotify is very strong on the Android side, and Apple is not. Apple has kind of missed an opportunity. I know that the industry's been pushing Apple for the podcast industry has been pushing Apple for many years to get a native app on Android, but they have refused to do it. But they do have a little bit of presence now over there, but it's not where it needs to be to directly compete with Spotify, and they've left themselves open for a loss of market share, and that's exactly what is happening today. They've lost close to 20% market share of podcast consumption and downloads over the last 2 years. So they're still, if you look at across the industry, they're still bigger than Spotify, but on the download and consumption side of podcasting, right? Not the number of users. Spotify has more users than Apple has, just because there's more devices out there. But on the consumption side, how many downloads get delivered to an iPhone is like 6 times higher than how many downloads are delivered to a typical Android device.
Right. And I think part of that is about the ubiquity of fast connectivity globally.
Yeah, right.
And I think that might be the next revolution in terms of consumption. Is there's a whole bunch of markets today that are, if it's a technology limit, those limits are about to go away. And if it's an economic limit, Starlink and maybe Kuiper are about to come in and change the economics around mobile data in a whole bunch of, and at least a couple of countries with enough consumers that start with billion with a B. That's got to be maybe the next big explosion and I don't know the stats, but I would have to guess today podcasts are predominantly an English speaking medium compared to, let's say, radio. And I imagine that will start to equalize as ubiquity of data starts to reach some of the developing countries. Yeah.
Well, no, I agree with you. I think that the market for other language podcasts has only been growing, and it's going to continue to grow. And I can make this one kind of bigger picture prediction, is that I think that YouTube will become the largest search engine in the world. It will eventually pass up Google as the biggest search engine. And the big reason for that is the fact that people are going to increasingly be able to access media. These static web pages and the ad-laden search results of a Google podcast are going to be replaced by AI queries, which Google has yet to solve that problem or that dilemma without creating a lot of clutter. And I think people may abandon using a google.com to find content. They're going to probably shift to an AI discovery process. And then on the digital media side, that's going to be where most people go to search for anything and any topic, and it's going to be in video form.
Yep. I was doing that this morning. I had to almost anything that involves taking something apart, assembling something like that. I load my YouTube app. I don't even think about Googling, how do I put this together?
Yeah. And just knowledge in general will be documented up there through like conversations like we're making right now. I mean, it's going into the Google algorithm, right? I mean, eventually I would think it's just far too tempting for Google not to access this content and index it and make it part of their AI training data. I would be shocked if they weren't already doing that.
Yeah. So you said the two evil letters together there.
Yeah.
So now I have to ask.
Yeah.
Let's talk about AI just a little bit.
Okay.
I don't know what sessions you saw at Movement in DC, but I came away, and I've said this a couple times before, I came away so shocked by the level of like FUD, like the range, the spectrum of like, oh my God, this thing is going to replace podcasters, to like, do we need a disclaimer if AI wasn't, like, all the, like, everybody's tripping over themselves for this technology to be evil, or, you know, to your point about, you know, making money on your podcast, it's the purity of the art form is going to go away because of AI. Like, there was just so much angst around it. How did you, A, how do you see it? And B, how did you feel about the conversations that were happening in the space?
Yeah, I think we're in a very difficult time period for podcasting, only from the perspective, and I don't think it's seen from listeners or viewers. I just think it's a very conflicted time, right? Because people are feeling the uncertainty of what AI means and how it's going to affect people's lives, and it's permeating all sorts of conspiracies and discussion out there that's, you know, concerning people. And I think that a lot of the AI companies, you know, Elon Musk is one that puts out these cautions that, you know, there's an 80% chance that AI is going to bring good outcomes to the world. But I keep saying that if AI is probably left to be pure, it may bring a better world because of the super intelligence that will come with it. The question, the biggest thing I'm worried about is humans influencing AI. Right. And because if AI has access to all information, every piece of data out there, it's going to be able to make better decisions than humans will, because it's not going to have that emotion behind it that drives a lot of bad choices. So, you know, I just don't see AI really having that big of an impact on digital media. I think that there's going to be things like deep fakes, and there's going to be images out there. If you look at what's going on in the market right now, most of the time people can tell an AI generated image or an AI generated audio because it's not very good. But I do caution when I say that is that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it may be better and higher quality than what a human can do. Maybe better sounding, less mistakes, can be really replicating what humans and their mannerisms and their gestures and how they move from a video perspective. And that's going to put us into a completely different realm that we have to be concerned about. But I still don't think that that's a threat to humans. Now, granted, we have to decide if we want to flag this content as human or AI generated content. And when we do that, we are putting a stop sign on AI content. So it's going to say, well, I don't trust this because it was generated by AI, even though maybe what is created there is actually genuinely good and very smart, right? It could be based on information that a human could not do because a human doesn't have that level of intelligence. So we may be kind of short cheating our bed on thinking that AI is going to be this really bad thing in our world.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, today we don't even have, like, today what we are colloquially calling AI is just like Clippy on steroids, right? Like it's autocomplete. And so like the scary part, you know, to the extent that there is anything to be scared of, is when we get to that like actual AGI, it thinking for itself, which that's a whole different thing.
Or super AGI.
Or super AGI.
Yeah, I was having a deep theoretical conversation with ChatGPT 4.0 last night on my phone, because I can actually trigger a voice conversation with the platform, and it knows a lot about me already, and it knows vast amounts of information in the world, and you can ask it some pretty interesting questions and it'll give you very interesting answers. And that's part of what I'm talking about, is that it has access to more information than I have. I mean, I'd have to spend a week accessing Google to find the same amount of information that it already has in its digital mind, right, or its neural net that can answer a question. So I think these tools are going to be extremely powerful for humans, and I think humans are fearful of this, that somehow they're going to replace the need for humans. And I'm not sure, I even asked ChatGPT that question. Is there going to be a time when AI is not going to have a use for humans? And it comes back, and I don't know if it's been programmed to say this, but it comes back saying humans will just have to adjust to a different type of life. Right. It's not that human life is going to be less valuable or somehow AI is going to extinguish it somehow. It's more to do with that humans are going to have to evolve to a different role in the information ecosystem of the world.
That's what it wants you to think.
It does. Well, it's what it told me, so it must be what it wants, right?
Yeah. Well,
somebody wants it.
Yeah. Yes, my favorite ChatGPT prompt today is, "Are you sure?" And then it like trips all over itself, being like, "You know what? You're very wise to ask me if my first answer was correct, because now that you mention it, my first answer wasn't that correct." So it's like it's seemingly
don't just take its
self-aware.
first response. Ask a follow-up question that challenges that first response that it gives you, and oftentimes you will get a very different answer. It's very fascinating how that works.
Yeah, and maybe that's the rub, right? Which is like we look for this, our AI to provide this certainty over questions that are fundamentally uncertain sometimes. So you have to think. So humans have to challenge AI too, and not just take what it says as gospel. We as humans need to challenge it. Especially if you think of the type of question you're going to ask let's say today ChatGPT is as short form for AI. The questions you're going to ask ChatGPT today, the interesting ones, almost none of them are a true-false answer, right? Like almost all of them have nuance, and yes, you should get 7 different responses if you ask 7 different ways, because that's the difference between them. Right? Yeah. But the expectation is for it to be, correct.
Right the first time. Right.
Yeah. And, which is only true if there's a correct answer.
Right. And also, I think what we'd like to think is that the AI doesn't have any biases. And that may be unrealistic, because guess what? AI learns from humans. And if AI is going to learn from humans, it's going to learn bias. So, how do we control that too?
Well, and then there's the Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox problem, which is like the more content that now it gets trained on that it itself produced. Mm-hmm. It's not to say that doesn't degrade like a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox, but the biases might multiply, because now the initial bias in his first training model now gets published in 70% of the articles helped by AI, and then it goes and trains on those, and then so on and so forth. Like there's some...
It's a little bit of an echo chamber of sorts, right?
Yeah. Which, next thing you know, somehow I end up on going down these rabbit holes, and I'm a ChatGPT person too, with all due respect to the other models out there. Every time somebody sends me a thing of like, try this question, a few weeks ago it was, how many R's are there in strawberry? And it was extremely sure there were only 2. And then you have to show it, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, you're right, there's 3. But it took a paragraph for it to admit that there was a third R. And then the one I saw the other day for the 4.0 model was ask it to draw a full glass of wine. It cannot draw a glass of wine full to the brim, or any drinking glass full to the brim. It cannot render.
Yeah, it has a hard time with actually spelling words too. For a large language model, it has a difficult time spelling words into images. Yeah.
And so that's also kind of my joke. It's getting old now, but my joke 3 or 4 years ago about, aren't you worried about AI and all this stuff? And I'm like, today I put my hand in a hand dryer and it doesn't recognize them as hands. It only has one job, and it's to like identify when human hands go in the dryer, and I do it, and it doesn't turn on. And I'm like, this is the industry that's going to take over the world? The one that can't detect hands and a hand detecting machine?
Yeah.
Now we're going to get to general intelligence in, my lifetime? I don't know.
Yeah, I asked Chat GPT when it thought that we would have super AGI, which is super artificial general intelligence, which is actually intelligence that goes beyond the scope of a human brain, right? And operates at a higher level than a human brain. And it told me 10 to 20 years. So that gives you some perspective of, now granted, some jobs and some roles in the world will be replaced by simpler AI, but the potential replacement and autonomous, conscious, let's say robots that look like humans, that function in the world autonomously, have their own consciousness, have their own kind of identity in the world, that is probably 20, 30 years away. It's coming. Yeah. Maybe. I don't know that we know for sure that the technology will evolve to that level. I think even Chat GPT gave me the impression that the intelligence of a human is far surpassed what anything that AI has. Now, granted, it's a big library of information, but it doesn't really have intelligence like we have.
Yeah, and I think some of that intelligence, I can't remember whose idea this was, but the concept of attaching meaning to ideas, or information, that's like the challenge, right? Like to your point, it has access to a lot more information than you or I have, but its ability to distill that into meaning,
right?
Humans are, infinitely today ahead of what a computer could generate when it comes to, here's a piece of information, turn that into an emotion.
Yeah. Right.
And we're really good at being meaning machines. And at the same time, there's certainly an angle there of like knowledge versus wisdom.
Well, right? And the soft skills too. The ability to create, really, from a genuine creational perspective. It's the ability to improvise, the ability to have emotion. These are all things that I asked ChatGPT about these things, and they said, that's also another 20 or 30 years out, and there's no assurance that AI will ever have the same level of cognitive kind of emotion and creativity that humans have, just because of biology. This is a conflict between biology and silicon and mechanical life of sorts. And that was another question I asked it too, was about the contrast between biological life and mechanical life. And if what we're going to see is that humans get replaced by a more durable, kind of harder material-based life form, right?
Yeah.
And that will last, that could live for, 1,000 years or whatever, that is relatively immortal because it has the ability to repair itself, right? And where humans don't really have that ability yet to repair themselves, even though I would say that that's coming with technology too, that we're going to be able to have humans that live for 200 or 300 years or more at some point.
Yeah.
Here.
That's a whole nother problem.
That's a whole other conversation, right?
Yeah. But it's funny though, that because I think about, you mentioned Elon Musk, having all these predictions about AI, but every time I think about him talking about how quickly this AGI is coming, I go, you told me in 2017 you could handle self-driving cars in a year. And
I have a Model 3 that has the FSD stack on it. And
it's like, hold on, if avoiding an orange traffic cone is this hard for AI, how on earth are we? Is it really going to make all these leaps and bounds to this place? And it was like, that's the part I can't get to. Is like, on one hand, you can be like, oh, AGI is coming. At the same time, like, self-driving is still in beta.
It is. I use it all the time. I mean, I think the car does an amazing job.
It does,
right?
But what he found, his quote, 3 years into making his 3 years prediction was like, this is a lot harder than any of you know. And it's like, by any of you, you mean yourself 3 years ago.
Right.
Because you also
you
said it
didn't
was
know either, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I kind of feel like, we might hit that point with AI, right? Just to overuse the analogy, right? It's like, oh, look, there's Summon. Okay, so Summon's ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And, let's say Super AGI is totally driverless, the Waymo, but you jump in a back seat and that's that. And again, you want to screw that up, you just, put a traffic cone somewhere and it all grinds to a stop. So,
right.
At some point, somebody is probably going to say, you know what, this is a lot harder than all you people know. And what they mean is this is a lot harder than we thought it would be 5 years ago. I think that, I mean, really to be fair to Elon, I've been an investor in Tesla stock since 2012 and I've followed him very, very closely and owned a very early electric car. I had a Nissan Leaf back in 2012, or actually I got it in 2011 is when I actually got it. Yeah. And it was one of the first batches of 100%, mass produced electric cars. So I've been involved in electric car stuff for a long time. And I just have to give Elon a lot of credit. I mean, we would never have what we have today if Elon hadn't the thought back then, 10 years ago, that he could do this, right? And put it out there and tried to build confidence in his team to take on such a monumental task. And I think it's got him a blowback because it didn't happen as fast as he wanted, but it clearly appears that he's going to solve the problem. It's really just a matter of time. Sure. Yeah. And it believe me, I'm also a longtime Tesla person, and
you are? Okay.
It's not a knock on him or Tesla or anything else. It's just like right now we're stuck on, okay, there's stop signs, there's green and red lights, it's a 2-lane road, everything's really well marked. It's a system with a lot of rules, and that proved harder than anybody ever thought it would. And now we're talking about infinite everything, unlimited rules, unlimited data sets, unlimited. There's no, totally unrestricted. And it's just like, well, if navigating a 2-lane highway was this hard, everything has to be way harder than even ChatGPT. Like, I'm not saying that it's wrong. That 20 or 30, I just think baked into that is a whole bunch of advances that we can't probably even articulate yet, right? Like there'll be some force multiplier that happens in 12 years and that doubles the rate, and then at year 18 something else will come that doubles the rate. But we don't know what those things are yet because
I think that there's two big constraints that I think that Tesla is struggling with when it comes to AI in the car, where basically these cars are robots is what they are, is what he's creating, is the processing power in the vehicles themselves, the ability to have good map data that comes from Google, which is missing a lot of important information, which is typically information that is off of the main roadways, right? Or off of like in parking lots and other types of areas on Earth that these vehicles might be traversing, right? And having topographical information. So I think that there's other types of information that are going to be needed for that car to be able to really understand what it has. I mean, oftentimes there'll be like directional markers that are on the roadway that it just doesn't recognize, or it doesn't take into account, or it doesn't see far enough ahead of the vehicle to really predict what's coming in a period of time. So that is another reason why you have to have faster processors, I think, in order to accommodate the flow of data and be able to make instant decisions. And I mean, it's not unusual for me to go out and just go on a 2-mile drive or something like that and have to intervene and take over the car because it just doesn't always know how to manage parking lots and know how to manage every type of traffic situation that exists out there. There's so many edge cases that they have to learn from and whether or not there's enough processing power. I've got a AI3 hardware in my car, it's a 2-year-old Model 3, and increasingly I'm hearing that the full self-driving unsupervised will require probably hardware 5 or higher to be accomplished. But Elon didn't know that 5 years ago.
Right. Well, that's kind of my point, right? Is like,
yeah,
his predictions in hubris said, "I will totally know that. Of course, we won't need new hardware."
Yeah,
I think
right.
he said that. Of
Well,
course, this will be able to. How hard can it be?
Right.
and harder than you thought.
Yeah.
And that's the analogy I'm making to AI, right? It's like, oh, we'll make leaps and bounds. How hard can it be? Probably harder than we thought.
Pretty hard. And it's going to take a lot of electricity. It's going to take a lot of processing power. It's going to take a lot of training data. It's going to take all this stuff. Can happen fast, but it also requires infrastructure to be able to grab that information. Just like with the satellites right now, the satellites just don't have granular enough data on the ground yet.
Well, I was at a trade show last week, and we're talking about needing to change redefine the way Ethernet works, because today copying a packet from the NIC to RAM is too slow for AI or
Wow.
AI processing. So now we're going to have super Ethernet, and it's going to be this, that, and the other, because there's all these constraints that a lot of in the same way that electricity is going to be a challenge. Just ability to move data around for a language model to consume it all is becoming a bottleneck in some of these data center environments. I still feel like it's going back to the original, the angst and uncertainty about it just seems like we haven't learned about everything else that caused angst and uncertainty. And maybe AI is different because of the potential down the road for the stuff that we're talking about. But like in the short term, in let's call it anybody today who's working and worried about their job, in their lifespan, it would look the same as being worried about your job because the microprocessor was created. Right? There's not going to be any more jobs because now there's computers.
Yep.
And as it relates to to podcasting, it's like the once AI is here, the art form is going to be dead. Just like, Pro Tools killed music. Oh, wait, it didn't. Everybody's still, there's just as many sound engineers now using Pro Tools as were recording on tape before. And there's just like, there's always, when there's new technology, oh my God, everybody's going to be out of a job because there's no more buggy repairs needed. Everybody has, cars and the horse and buggy industry. Everybody's going to, people adapt. Technology, to date, technology has always created more jobs globally.
Just different
they're not identical jobs, but ideally they're higher paying jobs. Like ideally, technology is a multiplier that allows us to find, higher leverage activities for people to do. If people end up doing lower leverage activities, I don't know that that's a technology problem. That's just somebody's making bad decisions problem.
Yeah, I've been increasingly thinking that maybe if I want to keep some sort of career going in the future, that maybe being an owner of task-oriented robots or a fleet of autonomous cars that can give ride-hail rides to people out there is kind of what maybe a company of the future looks like. Is maybe we're tasked with utilizing AI to provide vast amounts of services and capability to the world, and that is how we get paid. Is we're basically coaches to a bunch of AI bots, and that's how we drive value in the marketplace.
Yeah, I guess the question I'm posing, and I'll throw it to you because I think that is like, is AI actually going to be more impactful on, let's just narrow it down to people's economic future than the microchip in the mobile phone?
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure how far this is going to go. How deep of change are we looking at, and what kind of time frame? I don't think, you can talk to a lot of AI experts out there from some of the biggest companies in the world, and I'm not really sure that they even have a total answer to that question. Just like Elon has been saying that full self-driving is something that's going to be here, next year. He's been saying that for like the last 5 or 6 years, and it doesn't happen at the level that he thinks it will. And I think that is probably what's happening with AI right now. I think there's a lot of people that are putting out projections about what's possible because it's good for the stock, or it's good for investors, or there's glimpses of potential, and that's what people get excited about. And that's what a lot of these companies are fomenting. And you can kind of see it with the NVIDIA stock right now. It's like, it's now the largest, stock in the world right now as far as market cap. And it's even surpassed Apple and Microsoft. And that's AI, that's AI. So we are seeing an economic impact of AI that's coming into the economy and our world that's significant. But that's a leading indicator of what is coming, not what's here. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And even that, it still to me seems like if we were to attempt to, and again, I'll throw the asterisk on it. I can see how it's different. I'm mostly just playing devil's advocate, but map on every other quote unquote revolution. And it's like, okay, we had the Industrial Revolution, electricity, we had the telephone, we had the microchip, we had the mobile phone, we have jet airplanes, we have all these things. Every single one of them has resulted in us having the largest economy to date than we had ever any period before. There's never been a giant economic change in the negative direction as a result of new technology. Every time we've had new technology, it creates more abundance, to use a term that's probably overhyped. And maybe if I put my Wayback Machine hat on, each and every time everybody said, oh my God, this is going to actually not create abundance. This is going to be scary. And I'm going to have to find new jobs, and we're all going to be replaced. And maybe that's happened every time. And this is just the same cycle repeating itself. But I feel like we should be able to look back and be like, you know what? New technology's coming. Yeah, it'll probably be okay. Like the most likely outcome is that like everything will probably be okay, in the same way that everything has been okay since every technology that's come before us.
Yeah, and
like we invented the nuclear bomb and we're okay. I don't know how AI is that much more threatening than like global nuclear war.
Right. Yeah, I think that's at the top of the room
right.
when it comes to that.
But we're not worried about that as it relates to podcasting, right? Like, what if there's a global thermonuclear war? Who's going to listen to my podcast? Nobody's really worried about that. But we are worried about like, oh my God, there's a language model that can translate my podcast 5 times faster than this guy I'm paying to do it now. That's scary.
Yeah, and to kind of map this back to podcasting in the media landscape, is that what we might find is this ability that AI has will be so powerful to help us create the best content that's possible too. And increasingly that's how the kind of cutting edge creators are using it, is that they're using it to streamline and to make their productions better. I mean, AI can sometimes bring you terrific ideas about what you can do with your show, can help you keep focused on your genre, your topics, and give you ideas. I'm not saying use AI for everything. I'm just saying use AI for what it's good at. And what it's good at doing is helping you be more focused, helping you write summaries, getting information pulled out of your content that can be utilized in a variety of ways to save you time and to create content that humans have looked over before it gets put out in the world. And analyzed, and to figure out its alignment with the values that the human brings to that content that's created. And I think that's where we're at right now. And if it continues down that path, that is probably going to get better and more powerful over time. And what in the end here, what we'll see is more professional content that's more aligned with maybe listener or user information that will be able to create better content. I know, I don't know if you saw the keynote at Podcast Movement with Stephen Bartlett from the Diary of a CEO podcast, but he was up on stage. He's got a very successful kind of video show on YouTube, but he's also putting it out as an audio podcast as well. And his approach has been very data driven, right? So he's analyzing every piece of elements to his show that he's doing, and there's no reason why AI can't be a support tool to help him refine. Like he'll create like 40 different thumbnails for his YouTube, each of his episodes, and then each one of them will be analyzed and to determine which one is the best one, which one will draw the most results, right? And so if we start moving AI towards being able to make content creators more effective and better align with the AI algorithms that exist in the consumption platforms, then what we may see is just an explosion of relevancy to audiences because of the alignment that can happen.
I saw somebody I was talking to recently said they do more shows now because they're able to produce more human generated content because AI is handling so much of, to your point, the stuff that it's good at, which is preparing their show notes. He's like, I used to take me 6 hours of prep before I could do a show. Now ChatGPT does that, and now I can record 2 more shows.
Yeah, and that's going to cause really an explosion of content, right? And so at the end of the day, just like in television or in the movies, the battle was fought over the quality of the content. And so, what's in the content, does it align with audience's interests? And that's the priorities of YouTube. It has not been the priority of the platforms around podcasting. So when you think about podcasting, it's kind of, honestly, it's living in a little bit of the dark ages of content creation where, you look at a YouTube and some of the more digital platforms in combination with AI, and you can really see a glimpse into the future. Now, granted, these things don't come with risks. There is risks to this, and some of that gets back to what we've seen with content moderation and biases that are coming into the algorithms on these platforms around content, right? And some are being blocked, some are, there's downsides to having this deep data set on content and how content is created, and artificial limitations put into that about what words you can use or what topics you can talk about. That's kind of the danger side of this. Is it technology can be used for good or can be used for evil or bad? Sure. Right. It depends on your values.
And I mean, to your point, having humans being gatekeeping is probably, depending on your values, you put it somewhere on a spectrum. Right. And then you say, okay, and now it's not a human doing the gatekeeping. That's somewhere else on the spectrum. And again, but depending on where you fall, maybe that's better, maybe that's worse.
Yeah. And the question is, how tolerant is AI to the concept of free speech? And I think that's.
I can tell you, there's a whole bunch of stuff ChatGPT won't talk to me about. And one of my, if I'm very bored, trying to finesse it into saying things that it's programmed not to talk about is something I keep trying to do. Occasionally successfully.
Where are those borders, right? Or those barriers, right?
I do have a chat where I have ChatGPT being incredibly racist. That I managed to coax out of it. But it really doesn't want to. So if you're a racist podcaster right now, you probably have a whole lot of bad content moderation coming your way because the technology really doesn't want to let you. Right. Now, again, depending on where you are on the spectrum, for me, that doesn't sound all that bad.
Because I don't think that AI inherently has ethics and moral basis to its function, right?
Right.
And oftentimes people will say that, humans have imposed that in their world as well. And it's very possible that AI could have that too. So just to give an example that maybe other people have heard, but so a construction company comes in and wants to build a housing development, right? And there's a anthill that's in the middle of the property, right? But the developer wants to build a road, right? Over that, they just build the road right over the top of the anthill, right? And that kills all the ants. But was the intent of the developer to kill all the ants? No, it just happened because of the fact that there was a bigger issue. And I think that's the worry with AI, is that it basically comes to the conclusion that I have to do this, and its unintended consequences is that all of humanity gets eradicated. But we accomplished
I
our
thought
goal.
we were done with global thermonuclear war. How do we end up back here again?
I think it's a different form of that, right?
Yes. And even our perception of what the language we use around stuff. Like I remember, there's a very random example, but I remember I traveled a lot during COVID, and coming back in Canada, you would be randomly selected to have to go take a test at the airport. So like no matter what, you had to take a test. You had to do a test at home, and then there was quarantine and a whole bunch of nonsense. But you could be randomly selected at going through immigration to go get the thing. And I remember at the time going like, this isn't random. It's just a human going, you, that way. Like, that is not random. Random would be like you flip a coin, and if it's heads, I go, and if it's tails, I don't. Or like they used to have that I don't know if they still do. It's been a while. They used to have that at going into Mexico at customs. You'd press a button, and it would either be green light or red light. If it was red light, all your bags went on an X-ray. And if it was green light, you went through. But that was random. The button wasn't like, you're a single male traveler with 4 bags. I'm going to randomly select you. But during COVID, that's what was happening, right? Is like, I've looked you up and down, and now I'm going to randomly select you. But a lot of people would be happy to call that random selection. Right? Like, oh, that's just random if you get selected. It's like, it's not random.
Yeah, it's okay if it's random. Right.
Yeah. Like there's about 10,000 biases in here that choose what random looks like, right? So, if it now you map that onto like, what if at the time that was AI, scanning people's faces at the airport, randomly choosing them.
Right.
And it's like,
that person,
what are the biases?
Suspicious look on his face. We're going to,
because my training model says people who do this and this and this are suspicious.
If they smile too much, or they're looking scared or something like that, we have to suspect those kind of people. Yeah. Right.
Which is fine. Like, by the way, that's also fine as long as you tell me it's a, probabilistic, deterministic selection. Yeah, that's fine. But if you're telling me it's random, that's not how random. Why would you need to look at my face if it's random? Yeah. Right. I'm just the nth person through. Yeah. So like words start to matter in a world where you throw in those AI biases and human biases, and you add an AI, and it's like, what is random? It's not.
Yeah, it's not. Right.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like we maybe need to come back to earth a little bit.
Sure.
So, first, what's coming up? Podcast Hall, January is the next
17th.
Round? January 17th.
17th down in Orlando at the Podfest Expo podcasting conference.
Yep. And this is, how many years have we been doing Hall of Fame inductions?
It started in 2015.
Okay.
Was the first year. The event, unfortunately, did not happen for 4 years. So from 2018 to 2022, there was no Hall of Fame because of COVID and the fact that there were no conferences and those kind of things that were going on during that time frame. And podcast movement, which is where it started, chose not to hold the event too. So we've subsequently taken it back from Podcast Movement, and now it's part of the Podfest conference now. So this will be I think it'll be the third year that we've had it at Podfest. So
awesome. And is that streamed live online? Is that
that's what
available
we're
via
trying to,
podcast?
to decide. Last year we attempted to stream it live, and we had some technical issues with trying to get the video out of the venue. So that's what we haven't yet 100% decided on, whether it's going to be live or not. I think we would like it to be, but it's just whether or not we can technically get enough bandwidth to get it out of there.
Live on tape delay.
Well, that's kind of what wound up happening, is that we captured it, but it didn't go out, and then it had to be post-produced to produce a version that's currently up on YouTube. So if you want to go find it, it's the 2022 Podcast Hall of Fame and the 2023 Podcast Hall of Fame are up there.
Perfect. So 2004-ish to 2024-ish. If you were Elon Musk in 2004, would any of your predictions about podcasting have come true for 2024?
No, I think back then I was a little put off by the de-emphasis of having commercialism. I was very much a part of the radio space back then, and so thought through that lens, which gives me an interesting take on what's happened to podcasts over the years as the radio industry has moved into podcasting and become a bigger presence in it. A lot of the values of what these big radio companies have brought to podcasting is more aligned with their values of what they did in commercial radio. And that's what's creating this conflict in the medium to some degree around like maybe ad loads. The amount of ads that are in podcasts for the big shows is increasingly getting more and more. And in the research, it's starting to show that there's a little bit of pushback on that, that maybe that we've reached, at least in the big shows, we've reached kind of a saturation point that we probably shouldn't push beyond.
Yeah. Gord Vickman was on a few episodes ago, and he started in radio as well. And the interesting writing that he saw on the wall was that, his goal was to make it to being on-air talent. And he basically saw that becoming no longer the way you get on the air is working your way up through the industry, because all the media companies just want to hire celebrities that have a built-in audience to do.
It's easier, it's cheaper, it's faster, right?
Yeah. So the way you get on the radio is become a really popular podcaster, and then the radio will recruit you to do a radio show. Do you see that industry? Is radio too big to fail? Is it playing its cards right? Like, where is radio in all this? Because I feel like we don't talk enough about it.
Well, if you look at the stats, the real statistics on radio consumption and the demographics of it, I think the only thing you can take away from those numbers is that it's a declining medium. It's heading towards increasingly being more and more irrelevant in the consumption of video as well as audio content. And so it's not there yet. And it's been kind of a slow decline, but it's been declining. And that's why we've seen a lot of the big radio networks start building out and buying podcasting companies, is that they can see the writing on the wall too. And if they want to survive, they're going to have to shift increasingly over to digital distribution and digital production. And that is something that the industry has been a little, I don't know if slow is the right way to say, but resistant might be the better way of portraying it, because their infrastructure, their talent, their business models are all primarily focused on the broadcast model and how profitable that's been from an advertising perspective as well. But once they shift over to digital, that conversation changes with their advertisers. The expectations go up.
Sure.
And what those advertisers are looking for, they're looking for more instant results. They're looking for increased performance, because they actually have valid listener data more so than the broadcast side, which was typically the only data that advertisers had was, audience research kind of stuff, which is not precise data. I mean, it's audience estimations is what it is. I don't know if you've ever taken a like a Nielsen, a listener book kind of survey.
Yeah.
But I would not rely on it too much because I've actually been through it myself, where it actually has you write down how much radio you listen to and when you listen to it and all that stuff.
So it relies on the human memory. Great. Well,
that or just real-time usage. And what it does is it puts that study person in a situation where they're like thinking, well, I can't just put nothing in here. I have to put something in here, right? I can't just turn it in with a blank because I didn't listen to any radio.
Right.
I have to actually make this willful intent of actually listening to some radio at some point, right? So I can actually put something in this when I send it back.
Right.
So, is it real or is it kind of coached to some degree that if you're doing this recording of your radio consumption as the basis for how much radio is being listened to, and I'm artificially listening to radio, not organically like it should be, that maybe those numbers are not entirely accurate.
You can tell it's like any study, right? Who's paying for the study, the station or the advertisers?
Yeah,
I can tell you how it's going to come out based on that, right?
Yeah. So given that, I think the radio industry will continue to have a place, but it's going to be a declining share. And the other part I haven't talked about is the demographic profile of a radio listener. It's aging. It's much older, and literally dying off. Literally and figuratively dying off. And over time, this is a generational shift over to digital. Young people listen to Spotify, they watch YouTube, they consume digital content now, not on a radio dial. I mean, that's just not, they listen in their iPad apps or on their phones or whatever, and that's where things are moving towards. And it's going to take probably another 5 to 10 years for radio to really kind of disappear from importance in the vast majority of people's lives, but I think it's coming.
But safe to say there will not be another Howard Stern type person who just comes on the radio and becomes a giant thing.
No, and this movement, like you talked about podcasting talent moving over to radio, that may give them a little bit of life for a while, but I think the trend lines are still going to follow. So that's really kind of a short-term strategy to grow audience.
How about on the podcast side? If you get to be Elon Musk in 2024 now, 5 years from now, how do you think things are going to be when it comes to the podcast industry in let's call it 2030 compared to today? Does it look the same? Does it
I don't think it's going to, from an industry perspective, I don't think it's going to change dramatically, because if you look at the history of podcasting, it's been a slowly evolving industry, right? It's like, and even the audience growth has been growing between 2 and maybe 4% a year. So eventually we were going to get to somewhere close to 100%, right? And the question gets back to is no market ever gets to 100%, right? So there's always some percentage of the population that will not listen to a podcast just because maybe they're too old or they're too young, right? So that's kind of the progression that we're on. And eventually we're going to hit that 96% or something like that, right? And once we hit there, then we are the mainstream media at that point, right? And so it gets back to maybe the amount of content that's consumed on that. And then what does that content look like? Is it increasingly becoming more video, thought of as a podcast? Is it how much audio is going to be consumed 5 or 10 years from now, right? Is a big question. If we have autonomous cars, like Elon's trying to build, people will be able to watch YouTube videos in their car, or they'll be able to watch Netflix while they're driving. You know,
Right.
I mean, I think we could see
Sorry,
that.
to be clear, I'm not supposed to be doing that today.
Supposedly, right?
Okay, I got it.
Right. You know, I mean, actually, the Tesla car won't let you, but there's nothing to stop you from starting a video on your phone and setting it on the console.
You know what? It's just way easier to sleep anyway, so I just do that instead.
Yeah. But you always have to be looking forward because that camera is keeping an eye on you.
That's right.
So anyway, I think that, I think what we're going to see changes is going to be around what kind of content's consumed, what form is it going to be consumed in. But at the end of the day, if we're doing this for humans, it's going to be a human dynamic, right? It's going to be content that's compelling, entertaining, educational, all that stuff will rule the day, and that's not going to change.
Awesome. Well, let's leave it there. Podcast for humans. Let's try and make some.
Yeah.
Rob,
let's do it.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.
All right. Cheers.
Is different, another route, so much more to talk about. Gonna aim to satisfy with help from CacheFly. Get to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast. The Anycast podcast, brought to you by CacheFly.